I want to come back to the question of out-of-body experiences because, Sam, I know you have been the director of a study called the AWARE study, which is actually trying to check on this in some scientific way to see if there's a way to prove that the mind is more than just brain function. Do you want to tell us about your study?
Not right now. I just wanted to actually, before we can do that, I just need to touch back on, it's important for everyone to understand what we're talking about. I deal with cardiac arrests every week. I've resuscitated hundreds, if not more, of patients, and it's my bread and butter. It's what I do for a living. And the important thing which Peter was alluding to is to understand that actually, while there are many things that make people become very sick, but with cardiac arrest, it's understood very well because we have to understand the physiology in order to be able to bring people back and preserve their brain. So as Kevin mentioned, when you have, at the beginning, when blood flow to the brain gets beyond a certain threshold, then the brain does not function. Now, when someone's heart stops, immediately, when there is no pumping of the heart, there is no blood, zero blood getting into the brain. And immediately, a patient will develop fixed and dilated pupils. They lose all of their brainstem reflexes, which is why we can put a tube into their airway and they don't gag. And their brain stops functioning completely within seconds. Now, when we do resuscitation, with the best of efforts that we make, we can only get a little bit of blood, 5% of the blood that the person has ordinarily into the brain. And that's why throughout the entire period of resuscitation, the brain remains flatlined. And the pupils remain fixed and dilated. The brainstem does not function. The only cases where that may be an exception is if we have transiently restarted the heart and we lose it again. But when the heart doesn't beat, that's the case. Now, interestingly, to go to your question of consciousness, what we have is that we have many thousands, if not millions of people now who are reporting these incredible experiences from all over the world, many of whom have described our doctors, our nurses, conversations of what was going on. But you cannot have a functioning cortex in this time. It's not possible. So we're left with a paradox. So this led us to put together a more definitive study, which we call AWARE, Awareness During Resuscitation, to try to iron out some of these issues. And part of that was to try to study the quality of oxygen getting into the brain and hopefully improve outcomes for our patients so they don't end up brain damage. And part of it was also to try to study these recollections that people have. Now, our study has been analyzed, and we will be releasing the results soon. But I can just give a little snippet, if I may, just because everyone asked us. And what we have found, and this is not just my interpretation, these are experts. We have at least 20 experts from neurology to psychiatry to various fields in neuroscience to emergency medicine who have conferred the findings that essentially our data suggests that these so-called out-of-body experiences, at least when they occur in the cardiac arrest setting, which is why I call them visual awareness, cannot be defined as a hallucination. They cannot be defined as a hallucination. They are not consistent with what we call a hallucination.
I have an impolite question to ask each of you. It's one of the pleasures of having my job here is I get to ask you pointed questions. And so here's the question. And what I'm looking for here is a very simple answer, a yes, a no, or a maybe. Your best guess, does consciousness exist after death? Sam?
Okay. So here we are. We just said that.
Your best guess. We're speculating.
We don't know exactly what you mean by death when it's become permanent and stuff. But I would say that the way that we've traditionally perceived death, the way that philosophers have written about it, poets have written about it, movies show it, etc., that after a person reaches that point, yes, consciousness continues at least for tens of minutes, if not hours of time. And beyond that, we simply cannot measure or study it at this point. Maybe in 50 years we can. Was that short enough? Like I said, you asked a $1 million question in 5 seconds.
I had read...
Heard of NDEs?
Yes, I had read Rέimond's Mούντi's
Rέimondh
book
Mούντy.
from the 70s, yeah. And so, Life After Life.
Yes.
Réimondh Mούντi is a psychologist, author, and researcher who coined the term near-death experience in the late 70s. By interviewing people who had NDEs, he found they'd experienced many of the same things, like floating above their bodies, watching the scene below, meeting friends and relatives who previously passed, traveling through a long tunnel, feeling no pain and a sense of peace.
Again, thank you all very much. And tonight I'm going to talk with you, as I said last night, about reincarnation. And I want to say from the very beginning here that I am not the expert in this room on reincarnation. The Swami Swarupananda, for example, has spent his whole life studying this, and the other Swamis, whereas this, to me, has been not the main focus of my research, but rather near-death experiences. So I will enter into some speculation and thought about reincarnation, but with the proviso that you will understand that there are people here who know a lot more about this than I do. Well, the way I initially encountered the idea of reincarnation, again, is in connection with ancient Greek philosophy. And one thing that I find very interesting is that in the United States, at least, there's this popular myth or idea that the idea of reincarnation was introduced into the West from the East fairly recently, or just like in the 19th century. But this is not true. And oddly, the idea of reincarnation was present with the Greek philosophers from the very beginning. In that, Pythagoras was the person who coined the term philosophy. Pythagoras' life, to date him for you, was, say, around 550 BCE. And we know that Pythagoras claimed to remember 8 of his past lives. And not only that, I'm sort of constantly reading and rereading the ancient Greek philosophers. And in my latest study of Pythagoras, I came across the information either that I'd never realized or had just forgotten, that not only did Pythagoras remember his past lives, but he also had some sort of technique where he could get other people to remember their past lives as well. Whether this was some sort of hypnotic technique, as with the past life regression technique in the contemporary world, we don't know. But apparently, he had a very active understanding of reincarnation from this early period. Another very colorful figure in early Greek philosophy who was mentioned the reincarnation ideas was Empedocles. And Empedocles was a very colorful pre-Socratic philosopher who is the person who formulated the notion of elements. I suppose we've all studied chemistry to some degree, and you know that the notion of an element is the notion of a substance that can't be converted to some other substance or reduced to some other substance. And it was Empedocles who first propounded this notion that the elements are not interchangeable. And before Empedocles' time, this was thought to be true. For example, the early Greek philosopher Thales, for example, thought that everything was ultimately water, but that the other elements, earth, air, and fire, were all just somehow transformations of this basic underlying element of water. But Empedocles said, no, it's not true, that the elements are not interconvertible. But in his writing as well, Empedocles talks clearly about his past life memories and his stories about what he was in previous incarnations. A nice and very interesting little sidelight on Empedocles is that in the generation or so before Empedocles, there was a Greek philosopher named Xenophanes, who in his studies had traveled high into the mountains, and he observed that high in the mountains there were these fossilized organisms that obviously came at some point from the sea bottom and had been thrust up. And he realized that these very primitive creatures were fossilized on mountaintops. So that knowledge was already in the background by the time of Empedocles. But Empedocles went on to yet a further thought. He realized that the early organisms apparently were very primitive, but if you look around us now, we see very complex sort of organisms. So Empedocles surmised that there had to be intermediate forms that, since they weren't put together right, just didn't make it. So in his Origin of Species, and the footnote on very near the front of the book, Darwin gives credit to Empedocles for coming up with the first evolutionary theory. And then the person in the Greek tradition who propounded and articulated the notion of reincarnation most brilliantly, again, was Plato, who in his Republic and also his Phaedo, and as I recall also his dialogue, the Gorgias, talks about reincarnation, of which he was apparently convinced. Plato made some very interesting observations about the reincarnation process, that things that just come up naturally, I think, in our curiosity about it. One is, if we had past lives, why don't we remember it now? And Plato said that just before you come back into this state of existence from the other side, as he put it, you drink of the waters of forgetfulness and forget all you know. So you come into the world having forgotten your previous existences. No doubt that makes your learning experience here a bit more focused. And, but Plato also said that sometimes people don't drink quite so much of the waters of forgetfulness, so they come back and they have a little more memories of their past lives than most of us. One thing that I find so interesting about this little detail is that it reminds me of a very fascinating psychological notion called that of the event boundary. And it turns out that the mind organizes things for processing in little packets, as it were, like thoughts and perceptions and ideas will be put together in a packet. And that the mind sort of works within these structures or strictures. And the most common experience that I assume everybody here has had that illustrates the operation of an event boundary is when you're in one room and you think of something you want to get in another room. You find that as soon as you walk through the door into the other room, what do? You forget, right? You forget what you came into the room for. So very often you have to backtrack and go in, and then you can remember why you came in there. And that's what an event boundary is. And I gather that the Platonic notion of this waters of forgetfulness, you see, is equivalent in effect to an event boundary. So we can say that there is an event boundary between this existence that we're in now and the one that, let's say, we came from before. I wonder if this could have anything to do with why some people don't remember near-death experiences after a close call with death. I mean, that's just rank speculation. I don't know, but I suppose it's conceivable. There are three kinds of human experiences at least three kinds, that relate to the possibility of reincarnation. And the first one I want to start with, because it's the area that I have studied most about, are reincarnation memories within the context of a near-death experience. And I have heard a number of these over the years. They are quite rare. And as I gather, they have nothing to do with whether the person had some prior religious background which inclined them to the area of idea of reincarnation. The first two I heard, actually, was when I was in medical school, and I was in medical school in Georgia, and it turned out both of these individuals who had past life memories in connection with their near-death experiences had been Southern Baptists, of all things, which is a doctrine I gather that, you know, has nothing to do with the idea of reincarnation. But I suppose one of the most dramatic ones like this I've ever heard came from a wonderful woman named Vi Horton in Augusta, Georgia, who in May of 1971 had just an astonishing near-death experience. She was under an apparent cardiac arrest for 40 minutes and had just amazing things happen to her. But even though she had no grounding whatsoever in ideas about reincarnation, in her life review, she had an aspect of her life review convinced her that there was reincarnation. And again, I should preface this by saying, as people with these experiences often do, they say it's very difficult to put it into words because there are no words really to express these things. Nonetheless, she was a very articulate person, and this is how she explained it. She said, as she looked at this entire panorama of her life, she said from certain incidents in this present life that she was in, that there were what she called filaments. She said it's like little filaments of light would go back and connect with events that she could see that apparently had taken place in earlier lives. And the one example that she related that I think is most typical of them and was really quite startling. By the way, I knew Vi's family very well. I met her in connection with her near-death experience, and I got to know everybody in her family except for her mother, who had already died. But I met her two older sisters and her father and her daughter and her husband. I knew them all well, so I had not only her story, but also the accounts of the relatives of her who could attest to the amazing transformation of character that she underwent when she had her near-death experience. But Vi was the youngest of the three children and had two older sisters. And she told me, and her sisters and father also told me, that when Vi was 3 years old, she ran out in front of across the street in front of her house, and a car was coming along, and this was in the era before seat belts. And so the person driving the car had to slam on brakes, and what happened was that a 3-year-old child in the front seat of this car was thrown against the dashboard and killed. And that's what happened in this life. When Vi saw that reviewed in her life review, she said there was this little filament going to an event that took place in a culture she did not recognize. She did not know where this was. But in this event, what had happened was that Vi was riding on the front seat of a carriage being drawn down the street. And a child that she recognized as the child that had been killed in the automobile accident ran out across the street. And the driver of the carriage pulling back, then in this version, Vi was thrown from the carriage and killed, which is, you know, highly unusual. I mean, that seems to me a detail that wouldn't necessarily need to be balanced, but in this case it was.
And one of his neighbors was also in the hospital, and he came up and started talking to my brother-in-law, wanting to know what he was doing at the hospital and what he was going to do that weekend. He said, well, it looks like my sister-in-law is going to kick the bucket, and I was planning to go to Athens, but I'll stick around now to be a pallbearer. Later, I was also able to talk to him. He didn't want to admit it, but he did admit that this is what he had said. And I laughed at him because it embarrassed him.
In 1983, I met in Zurich Stefan van Jankovic, who was a very well-known architect in Zurich. And Stefan had been a colonel in the unsuccessful Hungarian Revolution of 1956. And he escaped after the revolution collapsed, and he and his family settled in Zurich. And in 1964, Stefan had an automobile wreck in his sports car in the Alps and was believed dead at the scene, but was taken into the hospital and resuscitated, and amazingly, he lived. And Stefan, as he told me, had been raised a Catholic, although he was not religious at that time. But he said that nonetheless, in his life experience, in his near-death experience, he saw several scenes in which he had past lives. And during his long recovery in the hospital, being a graphic artist and designer, he sketched out some of these places he had seen in his past life visions of where he had lived before. And much later, he actually found one of these places, which was a fishing village he had never been to, but nonetheless he had the outlines of the surrounding mountains and everything accurate in his drawings. Incidentally, I should say about Stefan's near-death experience and the life review, there was a very interesting detail in this, and he related one event that had taken place in Hungary before the revolution collapsed. And Stefan apparently lived in an apartment building that was at the top of a hill, and the roadway came to the bottom of the hill and dead-ended. So one day during the revolution, Stefan had gone home to eat lunch. Come to think of it, that's an odd idea of going home during the revolution to eat lunch, I suppose, but that's what he did. So he said that when he was having lunch there in his apartment, that he saw a Russian tank come rumbling down the road. And the tank came up to the dead end. And he knew that at some point the soldier would have to lift the lid and look up to see where he was. So Stefan decided, he said, well, you know, I'll shoot him. And so Stefan showing me the gestures, said that I aimed down over the hatch and just waited, and after a while, sure enough, the hatch came up, and the young Russian soldier poked his head up to look around. And what Stefan told me at this point was, he said, but I just couldn't do it. So he didn't shoot. And he said when this came back to him in his review, he said it was a point in his favor. And that was the word he used. He said it wasn't that if he had killed that person, it was going to be some terrible punishment or whatever, but he said that was, it turned out in his review, that was the correct decision under those circumstances. So all of the cases, incidentally, of these people who, within the context of their near-death experiences, have some indication of pre-existence and reincarnation, have been people from Western traditions, Catholic, Baptist, Jewish, and so on. And by the luck of the draw, I have never, until just about a year or so ago, found a Hindu person who had a near-death experience in which they reported past lives. And this is a very fascinating case, and believe me, you will be hearing more about this. There is a wonderful man, and his name is Dr. Razív Pardí. And Razív was chief of anesthesiology at the Bakersfield Heart Hospital in California. And according to Raj's picture of his existence up to this point, he was totally consumed by the material world and competitiveness. And he said his whole purpose in life was to have a bigger house and a fancier car than any of his colleagues. And then he had a very dramatic near-death experience in which he saw his entire life reviewed. One interesting thing that came out of this was that Raj said in his life review, he saw quite a number of interactions that he had had with his patients, and that he was very mechanical in his treatment of his patients and not very warm, and would respond to them rather coldly. But he said that in the life review that he had, he would see the backstory of this, and he would see the suffering that was going on with his patients. And this has transformed him, not just as a physician, but also as a person. And I've been with Raj several times when he's lectured, and one time I was sitting on a sort of panel, and Raj was here addressing the audience, and so I could see the reactions of the audience to this man. It's very powerful, and everybody was weeping and so on. He's a very kind-hearted, very sweet person, and to see this kind of transformation in him. But within his near-death experience, he saw very vivid portrayals of his past lives. So, although this is rare statistically, that if you had, say, 1,000 reports of near-death experiences, there would be relatively few, I think, that in which people recall a past life. A lot more people say, not that they saw anything that directly indicated to them that there's reincarnation, but that they had somehow a sense from their time on the other side that they really sort of didn't get far enough into the picture to see reincarnation, but they came back from this experience very much more sympathetic to the idea. The second kind of experience that that human experience that relates to past lives and reincarnation are spontaneous past life recollections. And these occur in adults. The way I first became aware of this was in about 86, 87, I guess. I have a good friend who's a travel agent and who sometimes takes tours around Europe, and came to me years ago because she had witnessed something so curious on her recent tour. She had taken a group of American tourists to Europe, and among the people who went was a very rigid American businessman. And when they got into a little town in Italy, this man just fell apart because he had very, very, very vivid memories of having a life in this little town in Italy, whereas he had never really, in this dimension, never gone outside of the United States. So they do happen in adults, and they also happen, I am convinced, in children. This is just a very common thing, and it does not require that the parents have any interest or inclination to this whatsoever. And I know, because mostly in the communities I live, the association network I have does not consist of people with these kinds of interests. But this is something that has fairly regularly, people over the years have brought up to me. They've said, you know, my 3-year-old is talking about some previous existence. So the parents come and you know, are very curious about this. It has happened to me with my own 2 adopted children. Now, Carter, who we adopted at birth from Kerrville, Texas, is Mexican-American by heritage. And Carol Ann, now 14, we adopted at birth from Montana, and she is Blackfeet, Native American. And both of those kids have spontaneously related memories of previous existence. Carter, when he was 5, he and I were up on the bed watching TV, and I was flipping through the channels with the remote control. And I flipped through what turned out to be the National Geographic channel. And when I did, Carter became very, very animated. And he said, Dad, that's my village. And so he went on to explain that when I turned back to the National Geographic channel, as it was a documentary about village life in China. And Carter started this long story of how his mother and father in China and his brothers and sisters. And he could see that I was rather startled. So as though to orient me, he said, yeah, and then I was up in the trees looking down at you and Mom. And I knew exactly what he was talking about, because 5 years before Carter was conceived, my wife and I were in Greece on a tour, and we were just exhausted from the flight. So at an archaeological site, we were so tired that the attendant could tell, and he said, just go over there and lie down in the grass and take a nap. And there were trees all around. And what we were talking about was adopting a child. Then my little Native American daughter, about, say, 4 years ago, again out of nowhere, we take these long walks. She said one day to me, I don't like this place. And it was plain to me that what she meant was, I don't like this world. So I just said, oh, and she said, yeah. She said, you know, when you die, you just go up and you be with God, and He holds you there till all the people you know while you're alive have died, and then He sends you back as another person. And I said, well, what makes you think that? And she said, just like this, she just said, I know in my mind. And she said, and yeah, I was with God, and He pointed you out to me. And He said, you got to go down and be His daughter. And I said, well, how did you feel about that? And she said, oh, I didn't want to do it. She said, I wanted to stay with my Gandhi. And I said, well, are you glad you came anyway? And she said, yeah, yeah. And incidentally, it's easy, I think, for you to imagine maybe, if, you know, to say, well, sure, you know, at home he talks about this and so on. But no, actually, Cheryl and I, my wife, we don't talk about life after death. We talk about what's for dinner, you know, the kids' homework, how to pay the phone bill, you know, what's on at the movies. And we don't take these kids to any sort of religious institutions because we're from Alabama. And as I was saying today, I was like, we're afraid of snakes, right? So, you know, they really just don't have any religious training. And interestingly, both of them have found out that I wrote the book Life After Life from the internet. And so, you know, I can be absolutely assured that I didn't put these ideas into these kids' heads. And so it's so consistent with what I've heard from many people over a long period of time that I am convinced that, that this is just a very common experience with kids. And what I surmise happens is that by and large the parents don't want to hear this, so they just sort of get the kid to stop talking about it or say, oh, that's your imagination or whatever. Sometimes these spontaneous past life experiences can have profound effects on people. And I'm sorry to be repeating this for those of you who were this afternoon in the workshop, but it's nonetheless, I mean, I think it's such interesting information. Arnold Toynbee, who wrote a study of history in 11 volumes, when you get to the very end of that book, in volume 11, Toynbee starts talking about why he studied history. And the story is that when he was a young man, 23 years of age, he went on a summer tour to Greece, and I think it was in 1917 or so. And so during that summer trip through Greece, he had several incidents that came on him out of nowhere, in which he says, to use his exact words, he said, I dropped through a pocket in time. And if you read this, you see that Toynbee understood that it was real. Like, he didn't think of it as a fantasy. To him, it was a real event. He said several occasions he just lost track of time in the 20th century and was propelled back to ancient Greece and saw people there. And he said during one of these incidents, he saw this horrific battle with so much, you know, horror, so many horrors, that he said, I decided at that moment to study history to try to understand the role of sin in the affairs of man. Now, Gibbon, who wrote Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, had a similar experience. And I have known a number of history professors over the years, as I have talked about this, who acknowledge that that's how they got interested in history too, was through some sort of spontaneous transmission back to the past, or some kind of spontaneous memory of a previous existence. And then the third kind of experience that people have that relate to the possibility of reincarnation are past life regressions, the hypnotic induction of a trance to regress people back. I first heard about this from a friend, or I first experimented with it myself through a friend of mine named Diana Denholm, who is a clinical psychologist in Florida. And Diana was using hypnosis not for the purpose of past life regression, but rather for the normal things it's used for, to help people stop smoking and this sort of thing. And she began to use it to try to help people understand their early lives. And she said several times it would happen when she would regress people back to their early childhood, that they wouldn't stop there and they would sort of spontaneously pop back into a previous existence. So that interested her in this, and then she began to do it as part of her practice. And so I got interested in it. I must confess, I am just so crass in so many of my prejudices and so on, as I increasingly realize as I get older. But I remember very specifically the attitude that I had toward the idea of past life regression when I was hearing this. And that was that I assumed, you know, what you hear in the popular press is that everybody is either Napoleon or Cleopatra, right? Or that the people who can do this are very suggestible or histrionic people. But what I quickly learned is that that's just not correct. It's I've taken maybe 300 or so of my students through the years through this past life regression experience, and all that experience I've never had any of them relate being a famous person, or all of them were just very mundane lives. And so I don't know what to make of this this hypnotic regression. I just don't know. But those are my impressions, is that it's not what the popular view tells you, that it's, you know, people are always somebody famous. It doesn't work that way. One question that the whole notion of reincarnation raises is, what is it that survives? You know, it's like, as I've come to acknowledge or realize, I guess, in the past 3 years or so, I've acknowledged now, to my utter surprise, there is an afterlife. I'm still reeling from that realization. But therefore, the question becomes even more acute. Then what is it that survives? And if you take the classical answers to this in the West, it begins with the notion of the soul. And Plato, for example, had a very elaborate theory of the soul, that the soul is an immaterial entity that inhabits the body. And to Plato, the essence of our personal identity is the soul. The body is secondary and unreal. The soul and the consciousness is the real part to Plato, and the material substance of the body is always changing and in flux and flow, and not intelligible and not real. And so his idea was that the essence of a personal identity is this immaterial thing or entity or substance called the soul. And this was taken up in Western thought, as we all know, through the Middle Ages and so on, into the church. And it was only, say, in the 17th century that real objections and concerns began to be raised about this. And Thomas Hobbes, for example, in the 17th century raised the objection that the idea of an immaterial entity or immaterial substance is self-contradictory and nonsensical. But still the question was, what is it that constitutes our personal identity? And so then 100 years or so elapsed, and then along came John Locke, who thought that the essence of what makes a person the person that that person is are our memories, that in effect we are our memories, and that's what makes us up. And this becomes highly dubious when you realize what a flimsy thing memory is and how it's constantly changing. It's not really as stable as we imagine. And then, in the 18th century, Hume came along and said, well, in his own introspective process, when he looked inside of himself, he could never find any sort of underlying substrate of a self. It was always the only thing he could catch in action were individual perceptions or ideas or feelings or whatever, and that he couldn't introspect or intuit any underlying self that was the basis of all these things. So that is a sketch, more or less, of how thought about personal identity and what it is that could survive bodily death has gone in the Western intellectual tradition. And so what do I think about it? Well, this realization I had several years ago, or coming to terms with the idea that there does appear to be an afterlife, really set me to thinking about that what is it that constitutes the identity of a person that is passed along or escapes this life to go into some other one. And long about that time, one of my favorite authors is Elie Wiesel, that I hope many of you have had the pleasure of reading. And I was reading one of Elie's books and came across this statement. He said, God made man because he loves stories. And that hit me as, oh my God, I just had all kinds of thoughts about that because before I went into forensic psychiatry, I spent some time in geriatric psychiatry and had this wonderful year or so where I had, in addition to my patients with Alzheimer's and Pick's disease and other kinds of dementias, I had plenty of patients who were elderly but who were very cognitively sharp and who were just seeing me because of some situational stress or whatever. And I constantly heard from people, as they would tell me their life stories, I heard the same idea expressed many times. They would say that the older they became, the more the impression developed, the uncanny but undeniable impression developed as they looked back at their life that it had been a sort of script or a play or a drama. And then when I read that Elie Wiesel said, it just came together. Yes, you know, what is a person really? What is the identity of a human person except that person's life story? I mean, that's about, really, as far as I can tell, that's very close to the essence of a person, is that person's story. And then I also heard that on one of the tapes by Joseph Campbell, related that he had that same experience, that when he got old, he began to look back on his life and just developed this irresistible impression that it had been kind of scripted or drafted, a drama. So at least here in January of 2015, that's where I've come to it. I think that the essence of life is story, and that this thing that we're in is a kind of illusionary drama. You think of all of the Shakespeare, all the world's a stage, for example, and one man in his life plays many roles. And I read a statement by a playwright about a year ago who said, a play is just a life with the boring parts taken out. I mean, I have brought back also a very dramatic experience I had in Charlottesville in 1967. A Broadway musical came through town, and I forgot what one it was, but it was a Broadway musical comedy. And our best friend was the guy who brought the entertainment to UVA, so we got these great seats, and we were on the front row. And in this musical comedy, there was a really terrific comic villain, complete with dark stovepipe hat and the black cape, the whole thing. And at the end of the play, when all the performers came out for their curtain call, when the hero and heroine came out, there were these wild applause, and all the supporting actors and actresses came out, and wild applause. And then the villain came out, and silence. All right, think about it. And it was really fascinating because you could actually feel the waking up of the people, right? That they come like, oh my God, this is just a play. And then they started clapping, right? I know this sounds rather crazy, but my best estimate at this point in my life is that, as I've heard from a long time ago from my friends here, that the Hindu view that this is a play, kind of a screen of illusions. And I feel that more and more the older I get. You see all of these uncanny things begin to unfold in your life. In one way, you might look at this and you say, well, that's just a metaphor. You're taking this one aspect of human life, the theater, and you're projecting that out as an explanation of the whole, and that's a logical fallacy. But I don't think so. I think it happened the other way around. What I think is that, you know, the history of the drama is really one of the most sensational stories of history to me. It's basically, there was this ruler of Athens named Pisistratus, and in Athens there had been this traditional festival of singing and chanting and so on, and it was a harvest festival, I think. And there were stories that came out through these choruses that would sing these things. And one person, Thespis, stepped forward at one of these things and became, in effect, the first actor to speak his separate lines. And this so impressed Pisistratus that he set up a competition. And you know, the Greeks had this incredible streak of competitiveness. You know, imagine these very complex societies, really, who are constantly at war with the other city 20 miles down the road. I mean, that's pretty crazy. So competition was throughout that culture. So he set up a competition to see to see who could come up with the best of these new kind of instruments, what we call plays. And Aeschylus came along, and his innovation was that he had two characters speaking. Then came Sophocles, and his innovation was he got it up to three. And then with Euripides, we have a whole cast of people. And that was the history of drama. And 50 years after they started this competition, acting and being in the theater was already a profession. Initially, the theaters were temples to the gods or goddesses, and these plays were enacted within them. But what I think probably happened is that people like Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, being very brilliant observers of human natures, you can tell from those plays, that they had picked up on this aspect of life, that when you get old, you look back and you see this dramatic structure to it, a beginning and a middle and an end and all the twists and so on. And so that they just decided, hey, we can create a space here where we can condense this and put it on for people's amusement. One other little point I want to raise, every time I read the Republic, every 4 years or so, I see details in it and I think, how in the world did I miss that? And this last time, about a year ago, I read the Republic, I saw something that I'm still reeling from this, because the Republic ends in this story of the Armenian warrior, who had a near-death experience. And is describing what he saw on the other side. And near the last of his narrative, he's describing what he saw about the people who were lining up to get into this world. And he said the last thing that happened was that they would go down to this place, and you can see it for yourself and read it for yourself and see what you think and see, maybe I'm imagining things, right? I might well be. But it looks to me that what Plato was trying to describe is some sort of screen, almost like a computer screen, because they're looking down. These people are getting ready to go over to this world, and they're looking down, and there's a guide there who shows them on this flat surface are depicted all the different kinds of patterns of lives that this person could choose to go into. And some of them are criminals, and some of them are holy people, the whole gamut. I think it would go along very well with the idea of a drama, that this life we're living in is it's a stage show, in a way, that we're going through, hopefully, to learn things and experience things. What I'm really faced with now is, with this knowledge and understanding, what's the best way to behave in this world? When I was talking about this with some of the students earlier today, somebody said, well, gosh, why wouldn't you just have license to go and do terrible things? Well, number one, doing terrible things feels bad. And also, we know that in our life review, whatever we put out there, we're going to have to get back, right? Because the actions you put out to others in the final phase of your life, in your life review, you review those identical same actions, but from the perspective of the people with whom you've interacted. So this is still a big mystery to me, and I'm so grateful to all my friends here and my long association with them as we're all trying together, I think, to understand more about this rather incomprehensible world that we're living in. And I want to say again to all of you, thank you so much for this. It's just been delightful to be with you, and I hope I'll get to see you all again. Tomorrow at 2 o'clock at my workshop, I'm going to talk about grief. And in that connection, we will talk about also other kinds of spiritual experiences related to death and dying. But the reason I want to talk about grief is that this is almost always a factor in what brings people to a concern with the question of an afterlife. Is very often they lose a loved one to death, and then they turn to this afterlife question with a very great urgency. And grief itself is an inherently fascinating process. I think grief is one of the big mysteries of the mind. So we will talk about that tomorrow. And again, thank you all so much for this wonderful opportunity to be with you.
Once you got to the other side of the tunnel, what happened then?
On the other side of the tunnel, I could see a light, and I was greeted by two very robust young men who were radiating peace, joy, and who were there to help me. And those beings told me telepathically that they were my archangels. They were Raphael and Michael, which made total sense to me, because Michael being the angel of strength, and Raphael being the angel of healing and of doctors. And when I told my wife my story about who I met, her first reaction was, what happened to the thousands of Indian god and goddesses? None of them showed up. That was, I had no answer for it, but I got to tell it the way it was.
Right.
And then these angels imparted me with wisdom, imparted me with knowledge, with divine knowledge, like what consciousness is, why we are here, what is the purpose of life, and what is the purpose of my life. And they helped me guide towards a light being, which was like 1,000 suns at the same time, but it was amazingly not hurting the eyes. And I floated above the meadows, roses of different colors, and I still had the mountain stream in front of my eyes, clear mountain stream. And it had the air had a very sweet aroma to it, and I could hear a distant chime which sounded like Om. And from there I found myself in presence of a light being. The way I can describe is that I felt as a part of the light and not being a part at the same time. It's almost paradoxical, but the best metaphor I can give you would be like ocean and the waves. Like I'm part of the ocean, but I'm separate from the ocean. And what I was really feeling is very hard to describe. The closest I can describe it in the earthly language is love, or using a Sanskrit word shanti. I felt supreme harmony, peace, love and joy, total bliss, like what has been described in the Indian literature, the nature of consciousness is. And from there, the consciousness, the light being, spoke to me without speaking. It was more of a knowing, like what my life is going to be spared. I have to still go back and finish my dharma, my purpose in life, my soul contract. But it will be a very different life from now what I had led before. And instead of a materialistic focused life, it will be spiritually focused life. that I have to help people, especially with the diseases, what I call diseases of the soul, depression, chronic pelvic pain, and addictions. And that was one of the reasons I suffer from them. So I have empathy for people who are going through that themselves. And from there my consciousness traveled to different realms. The first realm it traveled to was a very hellish realm. It was pitch dark, there was thunderstorm, there was lightning, and there were very dark entities with crooked teeth running about, and I could hear different souls crying and wailing. Then I was made to lie on a bed of nails, and I was kind of tortured. My first reaction was, why am I here? And I asked them to stop. And I asked for anybody who could help me out. And then, after I realized why I had been here was because I had been a very mean person, a very unloving person, and not caring and getting ahead in life no matter what it took was my way of getting ahead in life. And then my father showed up, and he led me from the hellish realm towards a tunnel on where there was a bright light outside. And during the tunnel, traveled through the tunnel, I had review of my present life, which had started in the hellish realm. Then I had the review of my good part of the lives too, where I have been helpful to the people. But most amazing was I had a review of my past lives. And two past lives I remember very well. One was like I was a poppy farmer in Afghanistan about 18th century or so. And then from the opium sap, I started tasting the opium sap myself, and I got addicted to opium. And another life I remember was I was a cruel prince in the medieval times, and I was whipping the poor farmers with a whip. And that had led to my meanness in this present life, and my addiction of opium in Afghanistan led to addiction in this life. And actually I had suffered from a very severe wrist pain about 5 years before my NDE experience, and that time I had a regression done by Dr. Brian Weiss. And that time I had a regression done by Dr. Brian Weiss, and that time in present life I had gone back to previous life and asked forgiveness from the farmers, and they forgave me, and my hand got better. And I did not understand till my NDE how could one go backwards and ask for forgiveness. But during NDE I realized in the other realm the time is not necessarily linear, but past, present and future all fuse together and can exist as parallel universes at the same time.
Who doesn't love a good theory about space and time and whether time travel is possible? We're getting a good one out of researchers from Griffith University's Center for Quantum Dynamics as well as the University of California. The New York Post is reporting they're calling it the many interacting worlds theory. sort of sums it up quite well, too. In it, the scientists are saying that there are many parallel universes where every conceivable outcome occurs, and that these different universes interact with one another. Meaning a person could theoretically visit alternate timelines and potentially meet the versions of themselves when they were president, or maybe when they were a talking chipmunk, or even the universes where you never existed, like some sort of cosmic version of It's a Wonderful Life. Theorists say their ideas don't reinvent the physics wheel, but that it's predicting something between Isaac Newton's law and quantum mechanics. Now, of course, the question begs to be asked, if that's the case, how come we haven't seen anyone who's done this?
I don't understand till my NDE, how could one go backwards and ask for forgiveness? But during NDE, I realized in the other realm, the time is not necessarily linear, but past, present, and future all fuse together and can exist as parallel universes at the same time. So from the hellish realm, I went to the tunnel, and from the tunnel on the other side, I was greeted by two young, robust men. They were full of peace but full of strength. And telepathically, they told me they were my guardian angels, and they were Raphael and Michael. Now, it was very surprising to me being a Hindu, how could the angels showed up? And when I told my wife's first reaction was, what happened to thousands of Indian gods and goddesses? None of them showed up. And from there, I was guided by the angels towards a meadow. The meadow was beautiful, with roses of different colors. A clear water stream was flowing, and there was sweet smell to the air. And there was a distant chant which sounded like Om or Ang to be correct, which I later on found was a primordial form of Om. And then as I went higher and higher in the realm, the consciousness became more formless. That's what the angels had told me too, that at the highest level the consciousness is totally formless. And then I found myself in front of a light. The light was like about 1,000 suns blazing at the same time, but it was not hurting the eyes. I felt unconditional love, like I talk about, I could see love, I could hear love, I could touch love, I could taste love, and I could smell love. It was love all around. It's very hard to describe it. The best word I have come to describe it, the word I felt, was the Sanskrit word Shanti, which means cosmic peace, cosmic harmony, and bliss. And when I was in the presence of the light being talked to me without talking, that my life will be spared, but when I go back, it will be a totally different life. I'll have to give up materialism, maybe give up my career as an anesthesiologist, and be a healer of the soul, especially the three conditions I had suffered in my own life: depression, addiction, and chronic pain, and to help people with these things, three conditions, which I call diseases of the soul. And then I woke up with a jolt in the recovery room. My first reaction was to go down on my knees and thank heaven for the experience I had, but I could not get up. Obviously, I had bandages around me. And after my NDE, I got better within 72 hours, that I was ready to be sent home on oral antibiotics. My addiction to the narcotics was gone overnight, but my depression and chronic pain took some time. And my nature changed too. For example, what I watch on TV changed. I used to watch all crime shows before, like Forensic Files, Cold Cases, but now I hardly watch any TV. But now when I'm watching TV, I'm sitting with my wife and watching Food Channel or Travel Channel. So everything in my life, how I react with patients, how I trust the divine changed too. Like I saw the movie Secret one time, and I had made a vision board of having a house in Malibu, having a Lamborghini. But after my NDE, I started more trusting in divine and having more faith and more universal nature, that I took my vision board. It was biodegradable, and went to the ocean and just floated it away with a prayer to the God. I really don't know what is good for me, so whatever you think is good for me to happen. So that was my NDE in brief, which changed me and transformed me in multiple ways.